The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. The title of this lecture is The South Secedes. Things happened quickly with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. First off, South Carolina will act first, calling for a convention to secede from the Union, which they had threatened to do prior to his election. State by state, conventions were held, and the Confederacy was formed. Within 3 months of Lincoln's election, 7 states had seceded from the Union. Just as Springfield, Illinois celebrated the election of its favorite son, Abraham Lincoln, to the presidency on November 7th, so did Charleston, South Carolina, which did not cast a single vote for him in that presidential election. It knew that the election meant the formation of a new nation. The Charleston Mercury, the newspaper of the day, said, "The tea has been thrown overboard. The revolution of 1860 has been initiated." The tea being a reference to the Boston Tea Party of the early American Revolution. Within a few days, the 2 United States senators from South Carolina submitted their resignations. On December 20th, 1860, by a vote of 169 to 0, the South Carolina legislature enacted an ordinance that the union now subsisting between South Carolina and other states under the name of the United States of America is hereby dissolved. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all left the Union by February 1st. On February 4th, delegates from all these states, except Texas, met in Montgomery, Alabama to create a government called the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States of America elected President Jefferson Davis as the first president. The gauntlet was thrown. How would the North respond? Republicans refused to support any measure trying to keep the South and the Confederacy back in the Union. What was the president doing during all this time? In fact, it's not Abraham Lincoln. Remember, Abraham Lincoln will not be inaugurated till March of the following year. James Buchanan is president at this time. Although he thought secession of the South was illegal, he found using the army in this case to be unconstitutional and did nothing. As I mentioned in the earlier slide, both regions, the North and the South, are waiting for the arrival of President Lincoln, waiting for his inauguration, and wondered anxiously what would happen, what would Lincoln do? Reiterating, Abraham Lincoln, he's not inaugurated or put into office until March 4th. James Buchanan, the president at the time where the South starts to leave, does nothing. Although he's against it, he doesn't believe that he should use the army to try to keep the South in the Union. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. 5 days later, 68 federal troops stationed in Charleston, South Carolina, withdrew to Fort Sumter, an island in Charleston Harbor. The North considered the fort to be property of the United States and the United States government. The people, though, of South Carolina believed it belonged to the new Confederacy, which was just formed. 4 months later, the first engagement of the Civil War took place on this disputed soil. The commander at Fort Sumter, Major Robert Anderson, was a former slave owner who had nevertheless unquestionably loyal to the Union. He truly believed that the Union must remain intact. In January of 1861, as one of the last acts of his administration, James Buchanan will send 200 soldiers and supplies on an unarmed merchant vessel to reinforce Anderson at Fort Sumter. It quickly departed South Carolina when the artillery of the Confederacy started firing on it. In February of 1861, Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as the provisional president of the Confederate States of America in Montgomery, Alabama. On March 4th of that same year, 1861, Abraham Lincoln took his oath of office as president of the Union in Washington, D.C. The fate of Fort Sumter lay in the hands of these two leaders. Pressure grew for Lincoln to take some sort of action on Fort Sumter and to reunite the states. Lincoln thought of the Southern secession as artificial. In fact, Jefferson Davis sent a group of commissioners to Washington to negotiate for the transfer of Fort Sumter as a Union fort, to South Carolina, a fort of the Confederate States of America. This delegation was swiftly rebuffed and sent back home to the South. Lincoln had a dilemma. Fort Sumter was running out of supplies, but an attack from the fort would appear as Northern aggression against its Southern neighbors, the Confederacy. States that still remained part of the Union, such as Virginia and North Carolina, might be driven into secessionist camp if he were to attack Fort Sumter. People at home and abroad might become sympathetic to the South. Lincoln could not allow his troops to starve or surrender and risk showing considerable weakness. At last, he developed a plan. On April 6, Lincoln told the governor of South Carolina that he was going to send provisions, supplies, to Fort Sumter. He would send no arms, troops, or ammunition, unless, of course, South Carolina attacked it. The Civil War began at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861. Confederate artillery, under the command of General Pierre Gustave Beauregard, opened fire on Fort Sumter. Confederate batteries showered the fort with over 3,000 shells in a 3.5-day period. The commander of Fort Sumter, Anderson, surrendered. Within days of the fall of Fort Sumter, 4 more states joined the Confederacy: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. The battle lines were now drawn. In this war, the Civil War, there are strengths and weaknesses on both sides. On paper, the Union outweighed the Confederacy in almost every way. Population, the Union, nearly 21 million people lived in those 23 northern states. The South just had 9 million people, including 3.5 million slaves in 11 Confederate states. The economy of the North is manufacturing compared to the South has agriculture. The logistics, now there is, some would argue, an advantage for the South because a lot of the battles will happen in the Southern Territory, in the Confederacy. And the morale between Northern soldiers and Southern soldiers can be kind of a draw. In the North, the Union soldier may be fighting for maintaining the Union, as opposed to a Southern soldier fighting to maintain their way of life. Now, I mentioned the North had an advantage regarding population, but despite the North's greater population, the South, the Confederacy, had an army almost equal in size during the first year of the war to the North, to the Union. Now, the one clear advantage the North had over the South was its industrial advantage. At the beginning of the Civil War, the Confederacy, the South, had only 1/9 the industrial capacity of the Union. In 1860, the North, the Union, manufactured 97% of the country's firearms, meaning guns. They manufactured 96% of the railroad locomotives. 94% of all cloth was manufactured in the North. 93% of its pig iron came from the North. Over 90% of boots and shoes are manufactured in the North. The North had twice the density of railroad per square mile, railroad lines, excuse me. There was not even one rifle manufacturing company in the entire South. So we clearly see an advantage in the North when it came to manufacturing. Now, the South and the Confederacy was not without its own resources and willpower. The South could produce all the food it needed. Remember, it's agriculture. The Confederacy is primarily agriculturally based, while the North is manufacturing and industry. So the South can produce all the food it needs. Now, the major problem is transportation of its soldiers and civilians. This is a problem. Remember, most of the railroad lines and locomotives are produced in the North. Now, the South had a great nucleus of trained officers. In fact, 7 of the 8 military colleges in the country were in the South. By the end of the war, I'll be very honest, the Confederacy did catch up to a bit. It didn't catch up all the way with the North. It had established armories and foundries in several states to help produce ammunitions, i.e. guns and ammunition. But it would never catch up to the industrial might of the North. When the war began in April of 1861, most Americans expected the conflict to be very brief, especially if you lived in the North. You thought there was no way the South and the Confederacy can match the North and the Northern advantages, the Union advantages regarding manufacturing. When President Lincoln called upon the governors and states of the Union to furnish him with 75,000 soldiers, He asked for an enlistment period of only 90 days. So think about that. The president's asking the governors of the Union states that he needs these soldiers, but only for 90 days. So he doesn't expect it to last more than 3 months. Now, when the Confederacy, the South, moved its capital to Richmond, Virginia, 100 miles from Washington, everyone expected a decisive battle to take place on the grounds between these two cities. In the spring of 1861, 35,000 Confederate troops, Southern troops, led by General Pierre Beauregard, moved north to protect Richmond against the Northern invasion they expect. Lincoln's army had almost completed its 90-day enlistment requirement that I mentioned earlier, and its field commander, General McDowell, did not want to fight, not yet. But pressured to act by the president, he would on July 18th, 3 months after the war had begun, and he marched his army of 37,000 men into Virginia, into the Confederate territory. In fact, hundreds of reporters, congressional representatives, and other civilians actually traveled from Washington in carriages and on horses to see the battle from a mountaintop in the hillside, expecting a rout, expecting the Union to just wipe out the Confederates. It took the Northern troops, though, 2.5 days to march 25 miles. I want you to remember that. So these are Northern soldiers, Union soldiers, marching 25 miles. Now, the Union military is tired when they get there. Very tired. But they are going to fight. And early on July 21st, and students, I don't expect you to remember all these dates. I'm just wanting to give you the setup of what we're looking at here. During the first 2 hours of the Battle of Bull Run, 4,500 Confederates would give ground up to the Union, to 10,000 Union soldiers, meaning they're starting to push back. The Confederates would pull back. But as the Confederates are retreating, they found a brigade of fresh troops led by Thomas Jackson waiting just over the crest of a hill. So as the Confederate troops are pulling back, they come into a fellow Confederate brigade led by Thomas Jackson. Now, Thomas Jackson will say he would not stop. He would not pull back. And this would be the rallying cry, because they would say, look, there's Jackson with his Virginians standing like a stone wall. And of course, we know that nickname would stick, and that general would be known from that point forward as Stonewall Jackson. During that afternoon, thousands of additional Confederate troops arrived by horse and by train. Now remember, the Union forces had been fighting in intense heat for many of the 14 hours. They had marched prior 25 miles in 2 days. By late in the day, they were feeling the effects of all of this going on. And around 4 p.m., when Beauregard of the Confederates orders a massive counterattack, Stonewall Jackson urges his soldiers to yell like furies. This would, of course, be known as the rebel yell, and would become the hallmark of the Confederate Army. The Union begins to retreat, and this battle becomes a rout with the Confederate Army routing the Union Army. This was not expected. This is out of the ordinary. Observers from Washington overlooking the battle are shocked that their Union Army is being defeated by the Southern Confederate Army. Over 4,800 soldiers were killed, wounded, or listed as missing from both armies in the battle. The next day, Abraham Lincoln named General George McClellan to command the new Army of the Potomac for the Union, and President Lincoln would sign legislation for the enlistment of 1 million troops to last 3 years. Not 90 days, 3 years. The spirit of the Confederate soldiers was elevated by this victory. For the North, though, which had supremacy in numbers, it increased their caution. 7 long months passed before the North, under McClellan, would fight again. Meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln is becoming more impatient as to the timidity of his generals. In many ways, I want you to remember, students, the Civil War represented a transition from the old style of fighting to a new style. During Bull Run and other early engagements, traditional uniformed lines of troops facing off against each other, trying to outflank each other, will be seen. But as the war progresses, new weapons and tactics will change warfare forever. There were no civilian spectators during the destructive battles to come like there were during the Battle of Bull Run.